On the 13th of July 2011, at the historic Spreckels Mansion in Coronado, California, 32-year-old Rebecca Zahau was found dead, hanging naked from a second-story balcony. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department rushed to the microphones to declare it a tragic, open-and-shut suicide brought on by the stress of a family emergency. But that official narrative requires you to abandon basic human anatomy, physics, and common sense. When Rebecca was found, her ankles were bound. Her wrists were bound behind her back with intricate nautical knots. A t-shirt was shoved into her mouth as a makeshift gag, and a cryptic, painted message was left on her bedroom door. Today, we are going to walk through the physically impossible mechanics of this so-called suicide, the blinding incompetence of the investigators, and how the protective halo of a billionaire's fortune allowed a blatant murder to be officially erased from the criminal record. To understand the sheer absurdity of the police cover-up, you first have to understand the environment Rebecca was living in. The Spreckels Mansion is a 27-room beachfront estate. It was the summer home of Jonah Shacknai, an ultra-wealthy pharmaceutical CEO, and Rebecca was his girlfriend. They lived in a world insulated by extreme wealth, a world where problems are usually solved with NDAs and high-priced fixers. The nightmare began 2 days earlier, on July 11th. Jonah's 6-year-old son from a previous marriage, Max, suffered a catastrophic fall over a second-story banister inside the mansion. At the time of the fall, Rebecca was the only adult present, though she was in another room. Max was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, placed on life support, and the mansion instantly became a pressure cooker of grief, suspicion, and anger. Jonah's ex-wife, Max's mother, was understandably devastated, and the unspoken implication hanging in the air was that Rebecca was somehow responsible for failing to watch the boy. Enter Jonah Shacknai, Jonah's brother. Adam was a tugboat captain who flew in from Memphis to support his brother, arriving on July 12th. He stayed in the mansion's guest house. Jonah, meanwhile, spent the night at the hospital by his son's side. Rebecca stayed alone in the main house. At 6:48 a.m. on July 13th, a 911 call came in. It was Jonah Shacknai. He told the dispatcher he had just found Rebecca hanging from the balcony of the guest room. When police arrived, they found a scene ripped straight from a psychological thriller. Rebecca's nude body was lying on the grass courtyard. Adam claimed he had cut her down before police arrived. A blue nylon tow rope was wrapped around her neck. Her ankles were tied together. Her wrists were tied behind her back. A long-sleeved shirt was wrapped tightly around her head, with part of it stuffed into her mouth. Inside the bedroom, the balcony doors were open. The bed was moved. And painted on the door in black paint was a chilling, bizarre message. She saved him. Can you save her? Any rookie detective walking into that scene would immediately lock down the perimeter, call homicide, and treat every single person on the property as a suspect. You have a naked woman, gagged, bound hands and feet, with a villainous message painted on the door. It is the textbook definition of a staged murder scene. But the San Diego Sheriff's Department didn't see a murder. They saw a PR nightmare involving one of the richest men in the state. And almost immediately, the gears of a massive, systemic failure began to turn. Within weeks, Sheriff Bill Gore held a highly publicized press conference. With a straight face, looking directly into the cameras, the authorities announced that Rebecca Zahau had killed herself. They claimed she was overwhelmed with guilt because young Max was going to die from his injuries, which he tragically did days later. To justify this ruling, the authorities had to construct a timeline and a physical recreation that borders on the cartoonish. I want you to picture what the police are asking you to believe. According to the official investigation, Rebecca, a petite woman, decided to end her life. To do so, she stripped naked. She took a tube of black paint and wrote the cryptic message on the door. Then, she took a piece of blue nylon rope. She tied her own ankles together. Then, she tied a noose around her neck. Then, she took the remaining length of rope, wrapped it around her wrists, and somehow meticulously tied her own hands together behind her back using complex knots. Then, completely bound, she hopped across the room, maneuvered herself over a high balcony railing, and threw herself off. It is physically absurd, but the absurdity doesn't stop at the mechanics of the jump. Let's look at the autopsy. the very document meant to speak for the dead. The medical examiner found 4 distinct areas of blunt force trauma on Rebecca's head. These were not injuries consistent with hitting the balcony on the way down. They were deep, subgaleal hemorrhages. She had tape residue on her legs, suggesting she had been bound with duct tape before the rope was applied. Furthermore, let's talk about the knots. The knots used to bind her hands and feet were sophisticated. They were the kind of knots used in maritime professions. Remember Jonah Shacknai, the only other person on the property? He was a certified tugboat captain. And what about the painted message on the door? She saved him. Can you save her? The police claimed Rebecca painted it. Yet, when the door was tested, they found no DNA from Rebecca on the paint tube, and no paint on Rebecca's hands or under her fingernails. They did, however, find an unidentified fingerprint on the door that did not belong to Rebecca. This brings us to the outrage pivot, the moment where sheer incompetence crosses the line into willful blindness. Why was the San Diego Sheriff's Department so desperate to close this case? Why did they ignore the blunt force trauma? Why did they gloss over the nautical knots? Why did they excuse the missing DNA? Because investigating a murder inside the Spreckels Mansion meant interrogating the Shacknai family. It meant treating a billionaire's brother as a prime homicide suspect. The justice system is built to aggressively prosecute the poor, the disenfranchised, and the unconnected. But when the suspect pool wears bespoke suits and has legal teams on speed dial, the police suddenly lose their investigative teeth. Instead of treating the mansion as a sacred crime scene, authorities released the property back to the Shacknai family in record time. Within days, the room where Rebecca spent her last moments was scrubbed, cleaned, and sterilized. Evidence that could have been retested was lost forever. The police leaned heavily on a single piece of evidence, a footprint found on the balcony dust that matched Rebecca's foot. They used this to claim she stood on the edge herself. But independent forensic experts later pointed out that if she was struck in the head explaining the 4 trauma wounds and rendered unconscious, her limp body could easily have been dragged to the edge, her foot grazing the dust as she was pushed over. But the sheriff's department refused to listen to outside experts. They refused to listen to Rebecca's family, who insisted she was a devout Christian who would never commit suicide, let alone naked and bound. The authorities locked their narrative in stone. Suicide, case closed. Move along. When the criminal justice system fails this spectacularly, it usually means the victim is forgotten. But Rebecca's family refused to be silenced. Armed with nothing but a desire for the truth, they did something incredibly brave. They took the fight to civil court. In 2018, the Zahau family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Jonah Shacknai. In a civil trial, the burden of proof is lower, a preponderance of the evidence, but it also allows for something the criminal investigation completely lacked: actual, rigorous cross-examination and independent expert testimony. During the civil trial, the defense's suicide theory was torn to shreds. A world-renowned forensic pathologist testified that the bruising on Rebecca's neck was entirely inconsistent with a suicidal hanging and highly indicative of manual strangulation before the rope was applied. Experts testified that the bindings were undeniably nautical and incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for someone to tie on themselves behind their back. The jury listened. They looked at the evidence the police had actively ignored, and after deliberating, they reached a verdict that shook the San Diego establishment to its core. They found Jonah Shacknai legally responsible for the death of Rebecca Zahau. They determined it was a murder. A jury of citizens looked at the exact same evidence the sheriff's department had and recognized it for what it clearly was: a staged homicide. You would think this would be the moment of reckoning, a moment where the sheriff, embarrassed by a civil jury doing the job his detectives refused to do, would reopen the criminal case. You would think the discovery of truth would trigger a cascade of arrest warrants. You would be wrong. Following the civil verdict, the San Diego Sheriff's Department doubled down. They refused to reopen the case. They refused to change the official cause of death from suicide to homicide. They released a statement essentially saying that civil courts have different standards, and they stand by their original, wildly impossible conclusion. Jonah Shacknai, despite being found responsible for her death in a court of law, remains a free man, untouched by criminal charges. The civil verdict was even eventually vacated due to a settlement between the insurance companies, legally erasing the only sliver of justice Rebecca ever received. The case of Rebecca Zahau is a terrifying monument to systemic corruption by apathy. It proves that if you have enough money, enough influence, and if your zip code is prestigious enough, local law enforcement will bend the laws of physics to ensure your life is not disrupted by a murder charge. They will look at a bound, gagged, beaten woman and tell the world she did it to herself, just so they don't have to ask the rich men in the room any hard questions. If you think billionaires getting away with murder in California is infuriating, wait until you hear how a dynasty in South Carolina used the local police as their personal cleanup crew for a teenager found dead on a dark road. Click the video on your screen to see the case they tried to bury.